2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Young voters, they may hold the key to this year's election. They very well could play a decisive role in who is next to occupy the Oval Office. That's why both Vice President Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are actively working to court those young voters, especially in key battleground states where polls consistently show the two are in a neck-and-neck race. Bottom line, both Trump and Harris are fighting for every vote they can secure. If you believe the polls, in fact, these polls must be taken with a grain of salt, Harris may lead with young voters overall, but her support is splintered by race and color. As for Donald Trump's influence on the young voters, perspective is a wonderful thing. For many, the former president is the only candidate they've ever known. And good or bad, it may have shaped their worldview. Welcome to Path to the Polls. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Joining me as the clock ticks to Election Day, political analyst Daniel Cronrath. Thanks for being here once again. Appreciate you.
Bruce, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
First, let's look at how close this race actually is. Latest ABC Ipsos poll has Harris and Trump in a statistical tie, each getting 49% of voter support. Other polls just as consistent. Maris did a poll in key battleground states. Take a look. Arizona, Trump's ahead, but only by 1 point separating the two. In crucial North Carolina, which could decide this election, Trump holds a narrow 2-point lead. And our neighbor to the north, Georgia, has them tied at 49% each. Now, again, we've been fooled by polls in the past, and there's still a week till they start counting ballots, but this is a horse race, and turnout's going to be key. Who turns out is going to unlock that door to the Oval Office for either Harris or Trump? Daniel, if you talk to young voters, what sways them as a candidate's stance on the issues? If you talk with young black voters, you'll find there's a generational moment which provides a further challenge for Harris. They'll tell you that they don't think that the Democrats have done enough for black members of the black community. Is that going to prove to be a problem for Kamala Harris?
Well, certainly, Harris, I mean, the African-American vote and that coalition of voter, as well as young voters, are critical to any Democrat, especially Vice President Harris, being able to run for office. Bruce, as you suggest, these polls are razor thin. And one of the things that we really need to bear in mind is that all of these polls are also within the margin for error. So critically in the past, individuals will come out after the election and they'll suggest, well, the polls were off. They showed one candidate was going to win, another candidate was going to win. But if you're conducting a good national poll with a margin of error of 2.5% to 3%, we need to understand that any race right now that's 49-49 could come out 51 to 47, 51 to 48 for either candidate in that regard, and the polling model would still be accurate. To your point, what does the polling really indicate? It indicates a race that whichever one of these political parties and the candidates for these political parties are able to get out their core vote, they are going to be able to have success. I think the other thing, too, Bruce, is that you're looking at a scenario where in the past we've always had swing states. These swing states, every single one of them, when you're talking about only a point or a tie, effectively, in those key states we've talked about, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Harris typically needing them in the past. However, could she afford to drop one of those states now since Georgia and North Carolina are both in play? Of course, Georgia, we know, went for the Democrats in 2020, and Barack Obama was able to successfully win North Carolina when he first ran in 2008. So there's precedent for the Democrats being able to have success in both of those states. But to your original question about young people coming out to vote, very, very difficult to predict their behavior. If you talk to a pollster, their behavior is very difficult to model because you simply don't know on Election Day whether or not they're going to be motivated to vote. Here in Florida, we make it very easy for young people to vote in their first elections or their second elections. 8 days of early voting, absentee voting with no questions asked. And yet, at the same time, some of them don't choose to come out to vote. Others that I have in my classes right now, Bruce, are ecstatic. They've already voted. Where I teach, we were an early voting location, and students were literally leaving my classes to go over there to vote for the first time. It's kind of, you know, for anybody, regardless if you're a Democrat or a Republican, seeing some of their enthusiasm, being able to vote for the first time, you could really tell that they were engaged, civically engaged, they were excited. Lots of questions. They wanted to know how long the ballot was going to be, you know, what was the language in terms of the amendments. They wanted to have information about, you know, how to vote for our Supreme Court justices and whether they should be retained. So all in all, were there a large percentage of them not choosing to vote? Sure. For a lot of reasons, by the way, Bruce, that older voters don't vote as well. I mean, this isn't a new thing. There are voters 18 to 80 who decide for whatever reason they're going to experience apathy, and they don't want to come out to vote either. So sometimes I think that this generation is unfairly labeled as not necessarily caring or being involved, but I would argue that there's people in every demographic, Bruce, who aren't involved in it and who are not choosing to participate in the election.
And look, former President Obama has been quite present on the campaign trail for Harris, but his message was not resonating with a big sector of the undecided vote, especially in the swing states, crucial to Harris. Why do you think the pushback?
I think one of the challenges with putting out Barack and Michelle Obama, especially the former First Lady, to campaign for Harris, is that they both resonate with the crowd better than Vice President Harris does. The Obamas remain rock stars within the Democratic Party. If Michelle Obama were to run today, if you just anecdotally ask any Democrat, and this has even been polled to some degree, who would you like to see run for President of the United States? Michelle Obama leads in most of those polls. So it's a tightrope to walk when you're trying to harness the energy and the passion and the enthusiasm that the Obamas have still with the Democratic Party, but yet they're not the ones on the top of the ticket. It's Vice President Harris. So similarly, Bill Clinton is out there right now as well, appearing in different places, trying to gain enthusiasm, and they're being very, very selective about where these individuals go. I will tell you, you and I both having Pennsylvania origins, I was shocked when my small hometown of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, a month ago was played a visit by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez at a party rally in the middle of rural agrarian Pennsylvania. Here comes another celebrity and future celebrity, the Democratic Party, trying to whip up that vote. Again, very, very difficult because, Vice President Harris in many crowds just doesn't generate that kind of enthusiasm that these Democratic rock stars do.
Yeah. Another crucial part of the vote is the Latino vote, the faux pas at Madison Square Garden for the Trump camp. I mean, that did not resonate very well. Is that going to hurt Trump?
It very well could. I mean, that is the kind of faux pas when you look at mistakes which occur at the end of the campaign. I'm certain that there's people in that campaign who could take back a lot of, if not most of the comments which came out of that event, particularly by the comedian that they hired to open up the event that was really there to prime the crowd for President Trump. Trump is definitely making, the Republican Party in general is making inroads with, again, what we call the Latino vote. I say this, very, very sensitively. Obviously, people who come from Cuba perform very different at the polls than people from Puerto Rico or people from El Salvador or from a variety of countries. But when you look at that coalition of voters, again, Bruce, that was traditionally identified with the Democratic Party, that they really need to win. You see not just Florida trends, where Governor DeSantis has performed very well with Latino voters in the state, winning them comfortably in his last re-election, but nationally as well, with a shift taking place. Why? And we can speculate all day long. Typically, a lot of Latinos have more conservative values in a lot of these key issues. We're also seeing this with African-American voters, Bruce, specifically with African-American men, who tend to have, even though they've performed and voted Democrat in the past, they tend to have more conservative social issues. And a lot of them are feeling alienated now from the Democratic Party as they continue to move more towards a progressive left on issues that they might not have caught up with the rest of their party on in terms of their views. So, but again, in order for Vice President Harris to win this election, she has to remain and has to keep both of those core constituencies that we've talked about, people of color and young people.
Yeah, a lot of men, a lot of black men don't feel that the Democratic Party has done enough for them economically over the years, and that may not serve Kamala Harris well. And I mentioned that for young people, the issues are key in this campaign, especially the economy. Do you think that either Trump or Harris are outlining things economically well enough for the electorate, or are their plans superficial in the minds of the people who are going to the polls?
Well, I think it's interesting because if you were to talk to a mainstream economist, or if you read somebody like Paul Krugman or somebody else, they're almost in a state of disbelief why people think the economy is poor. Now, obviously, Krugman is isolated from the average everyday individual, being the fact that he's wealthy and he lives in New York and works for the New York Times. However, I think what they're really key missing, Bruce, that we feel in our daily lives and most of the folks that we interact with, is the impact of inflation on the economy. You can show somebody GDP growth, you can show somebody an unemployment rate, you can talk about the Gini index, you can talk about all these factors that mainstream economists use to register the economy. And if people's eggs, fuel, energy prices, food that they need to eat, and basically all kinds of things within their lives are more expensive than they were 4 years ago, guess what? COVID notwithstanding, a lot of people are going to hold that against the Biden administration simply because Biden was the conductor of the train when all this was taking place. Interestingly enough, when Vice President Harris has offered solutions to this, talking about price controls in certain key areas of the economy, what does their opponent naturally and rather smartly do, labels to the socialism tag. Here she is, she wants to cap prices, just like in a communist state or just in a socialist state. So when you use fiscal policy and you talk about some of the most principled things that you could do, saying, listen, this is all we're going to allow Americans to pay for energy costs right now because it's too expensive for people, but then your tack back is that's what they've done in the former Soviet Union. It creates a very, very sticky spot for Vice President Harris. And again, she's, walking a political tightrope. She has to stand on her own 2 feet and say that she's going to be different than Joe Biden while actively being President Biden's vice president. Very, very difficult.
And that's why she's distanced herself from Joe Biden on a number of issues as well publicly, which I'm sure hasn't sat very well with the president, though he has not made it clear how he really feels. He's been very political in dealing with things publicly.
Right.
Let me talk about a poll done by USA Today and Suffolk University. It shows by double digits, voters said that Harris had not done enough to explain the specific policies that she would pursue in office. 57 to 37%. Those who want to hear more include nearly 1 in 4, or 23% of her supporters. And it's interesting because that's in contrast to those surveyed who split evenly 49 to 48% on whether Trump had done enough to explain his policies. Just 15% of his supporters want to hear more about what he would do. Surprise you that those students think that Trump has done a better job on the issues?
Well, I think really what this is, Bruce, is an opportunity lost in some ways for Vice President Harris. I think that she was, obviously she's been Joe Biden's vice president now for 3.5 years that he's been in office, but she really had an opportunity when President Biden was removed from the race and Harris was put into the position at the Democratic National Convention to formally be the nominee without holding a primary contest, by the way. She had a unique opportunity to introduce herself to the American public, to answer specific questions related to the economy, to answer specific questions about what she would do differently from President Biden when he got into office. And Bruce, if you listen to a lot of her interviews, and her interviews, by the way, have been more rare than a lot of people would like as well. There was not a lot
People complained.
People complained, but there was not a lot of emphasis on directly answering questions. A lot of prominent individuals, even David Axelrod, President Obama's former campaign advisor and former White House advisor, accused Kamala Harris of using word salad to answer a lot of these direct questions.
Spoke in the abstract.
Speaking in the abstract and dancing around direct issues. Now, obviously, if you're somebody who's a Democrat and you're listening to this, you would say, when was the last time Donald Trump gave a direct answer to any question? Very, very true. And talk about word salad, Donald Trump. That being said, I think a lot of Americans were looking for the kind of that clean slate approach where somebody would come in, they would be younger, they would be able to articulate a message. And I think for a lot of folks, Bruce, those few independent voters that remain out there, she simply failed to seal the deal in terms of being able to close her candidacy. And now we're going to have to wait till Election Day to see where that vote actually falls.
And like it or not, people were going to hold her to a different standard than they would Donald Trump. They expected Donald Trump to be Donald Trump.
We know who Donald Trump is. We've seen Donald Trump. He's been elected. That cake is baked, so to speak, in terms of what we know about Donald Trump. This was a unique opportunity for Vice President Harris, again, to say, these are my policies. This is where I'm different from Joe Biden. Relative to your questions about the African-American community, I think a lot of resentment, especially with older black men, goes back to the Clinton administration, Bruce. Right. This was the era of 3 strikes and you're out legislation. This was the era where a lot of crimes were really, in terms of the criminal code, there was a strong racial element towards locking up black men, which has stuck. Obviously, Bill Clinton was a 2-term Democratic president. I think also, too, when you look at the Trump administration, this doesn't get as much credit as perhaps it would deserve. There are a lot of African-American voters who are very aware that his son, Jared Kushner, worked with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey to rewrite a lot of the federal codes regarding the possession of cocaine, that were viewed as racist in the 1990s. So, I mean, there's not one discrete answer here which is going to explain all of it. But I think when you're talking about being failed by the system, being failed by Democratic voters, certainly with a lot of African-American men, that resonates. And by the way, Bruce, just to put a bow on this, if you will, in the United States right now, it's estimated that 1 in 4 African-American men have spent time in prison. Okay, so if you're looking at who they're going to be blaming, they've had Democratic presidents just as well as they've had Republican presidents. So I think that also has to be factored in.
And more to your point, I think there are a lot of people who say, yes, they wanted Kamala Harris to do more specific interviews. And instead of, going on the attack against Donald Trump, they wanted to say, define yourself. Mm-hmm. Let us know how you're going to differentiate yourself from Joe Biden. Let us know specifically where you stand. I mean specifically on issues like the economy, on immigration, the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Let us us know what your plan is, how you plan to tackle these issues.
Yeah, there was a recent focus group which was conducted last week where they surveyed a group of voters based upon the Democratic platform and the Democratic message nationally. And the issue that polled lowest for voters in the focus group was Donald Trump as an existential threat to democracy. They wanted to hear, even independent voters wanted to hear about the economy, first and foremost. They wanted to hear about the border. Yet, when you hear Democratic sound bites, and you, especially if you turn on a more liberal media in the United States, everything is focused on Donald Trump, the existential threat that Donald Trump is to the United States, with very little provided in the way of, here's what materially is going to improve in your life if you elect Vice President Harris as the President of the United States.
Right. A strategy that works for Donald Trump isn't necessarily going to work for Kamala Harris.
No, because Donald Trump can go back to his first 4 years in office and he can say, listen, I cut everybody's taxes. The economy was booming. You look at the metrics, everything, before COVID hit, everything was going great. I told conservatives I was going to appoint 3 pro-life justices. Guess what? I appointed 3 pro-life justices. So he has a distinct track record. Now, you can look to his handling of COVID. You can look to what many consider to be unpresidential behavior, a lot of his comments, a lot of the things he's done, insulting of various ethnic groups, reporters with disabilities. I mean, the list goes on and on.
But he was riding somebody else's economic train. You can prove that, but it doesn't matter because on the surface, we know where the economy stood. He can take credit for it or not.
Yeah, I mean, presidents love to take credit for a great economy when they're in office.
Presidents have nothing to do with the economy.
Very little.
It's cyclical.
Yeah, very little. Very cyclical.
All right, Jen Dumagal-Goldman with All in Democracy Challenge made an interesting point about college students. She told ABC News what's on the ballot and where students think their vote might count the most for the presidency are prominent motivators for college students. Students are also influenced by local elections, and many choose to vote in the state that they identify with the most. So the point about where the votes might count is important because college students are allowed to register to vote in either the hometown or where they attend college, depending on state residency requirements. So as a result of that, some students have chosen to register under the address that gives their ballot the most impact. And that's especially when one of the residences is located in a swing state. And that is an interesting caveat in this whole equation. Goes back to something that we've been talking about when it comes to young voter influence and about the outcome of this election.
Yeah, well, there's no question about that. Now, back when I was an undergraduate, Bruce, back in the 1870s, no, back in the 1990s, there was also scare tactics that were employed. If you register to vote, for example, at the school that you live at, there was disinformation that you could lose your access to your financial aid because you were changing your address from where you had left previously. Various techniques to try to frighten students into where they wanted to vote and not change their registration to their college campus. Okay, the reality of it is there are students who make that decision. I think relative right now to Florida, a little bit off from your question relative to the local incentive to vote, I really can't. This is anecdotal, obviously. This is just in my experience. I can't really tell you how many young Republican students I have, 18 to 25, who are going to be going for Donald Trump and have already committed to voting for Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. So when you talk about important ballot initiatives here in Florida, the idea of recreational marijuana and repealing the state's 6-week abortion ban is motivating a lot of voters who are still registered Republicans, who are still loyal and want to support President Trump because they haven't seen anything from Harris. So I think one of the outcomes of this election is going to be very interesting. What's the margin, assuming that President Trump holds on as the UNF polling and other polling indicates in Florida, what's that margin of difference going to be between support for Trump and support for these progressive issues like recreational marijuana and preserving abortion as a constitutional right in the Florida Constitution? That's going to be very, in terms of conducting an autopsy from this election, I think that's going to be very interesting to see.
But the question becomes, if 3 and 4 pass, and the general consensus is that they probably will here in Florida, how important is Florida in the context of the national race? And there are differing opinions about that.
Yeah, I would say that Florida, just because of the presence of Amendment 3 and Amendment 4, I would predict that Florida is going to be an outlier. Okay, from the rest of the country, where I think that the presidential race will dominate. Also, I would argue, as I think other people may argue, that Florida, while we fancy ourselves to be this, we are no longer a swing state.
No.
This is a Republican state with a Republican legislature.
You don't think we're more purple now than we had been?
I do not. I feel like we're right now, I mean, when I first moved to Florida, Barack Obama won the presidency here twice. Okay, Charlie Crist was able to successfully run, as an independent. Now we're looking at a Republican bloc in Tallahassee and a Republican bloc in the Senate, which is something else interesting that I don't know if you intended to bring up today.
Talking about the Scott Mucarsel race?
The Scott and Mucarsel race, the Mucarsel-Powell, which she's in play.
Which is totally interesting because Rick Scott usually comes from behind and you don't have to worry about it. I'm not so sure in this case that he's going to make it across the finish line as he usually does.
I think Rick Scott's got good reason to be concerned. And I'll tell you what, I was looking at the, obviously Michael Bender, who runs the polling at the University of North Florida, does a fantastic job. Dr. Bender does. One of the things that was revealed from the crosstabs on his poll, his most recent UNF poll, is that among no party affiliation voters here in the state of Florida, Bruce, which by the way right now number roughly 4 million people who are choosing not to belong to any of our political parties, Vice President Harris has a 1-point lead among no party affiliation voters. Mukrsal Powell has an 11-point lead among no party affiliation voters.
Who'd have thunk?
Who'd have thunk? Demonstrating what? One, I think that there's almost an advantage for her not being as much of a known commodity, but actually coming off more as what we refer to as the generic Democrat. Okay, you'll notice in past elections, Bruce, how the generic candidate always does better than the specific candidate quite often when it's polled. Two, I also think, quite frankly, it speaks to the unpopularity of Senator Scott. I think even among his Republican base, I think you're going to see Donald Trump significantly outperform Senator Scott in this election. And again, when you're talking about only a point or two, with down ballot issues like Amendment 3 and Amendment 4, maybe Debbie Mukrsal Powell can pull off an election day surprise and actually, again, even though I've just said it to Red State, maybe she can break through and maybe she can win that Senate seat, which, by the way, nationally, the Democrats would desperately need an upset like that to occur.
This brings up another point, and I don't know that people are focusing on this as much. As important as the White House race is, some of those down ballot races and control of the Senate and the House are as important as what happens in the Oval Office.
Oh, sure. Listen, Bruce, right now, I think that I would not be surprised, and I don't think any of us should be surprised if the Republicans control all of our government after the election. You could easily see the Republicans maintaining the House of Representatives. You could easily see them flipping the Senate. They've already got a couple of seats which we know are going to go West Virginia for Senator Manchin. It looks like John Tester is going to be losing in Montana, which is currently a seat that arguably a Democrat should not have been holding.
Let's see what happens in Arizona.
Right there you have two. Yeah, well,
I think that's going to go Democrat.
Oh, for sure. And I think that the Republicans in Arizona only have themselves to blame for nominating Carrie Lake, quite frankly, because she's rather unelected.
Well, they're saying now that she cost Donald Trump the election in 2020.
Well, yeah, that's
a whole other argument.
How rich is that? But the point of it is, another interesting race to watch on election day is going to be Senator Ted Cruz in Texas. Mm-hmm. Another candidate right now who is very, very nervous, running against Congressman Allred. Allred running one of the more effective ads that I've seen in this election cycle, with Senator Cruz fleeing to Mexico when the Texan power grid went out, and him and his family were going to Cancun while Texans were suffering. That's the kind of thing that hits home, Bruce, that resonates. And there again, in most of those Texas polls, Donald Trump comfortably ahead, depending on the poll you're looking at, 6 to 8 points in Texas. Cruz, Allred, margin for error race. Yeah. Okay, what happens on election day? Can the Dems gain a seat there? It's going to be very, very interesting.
Right, because that's where the laws are made. Also, control of the Supreme Court. A whole nother. There is so much at stake when it comes to this country's future, other than the White House, that this nation's not focusing on.
One other final thing about the United States Senate, if I may, because we bring the Pennsylvania connection here to Northeast Florida, I think sometimes, Bruce. Bob Casey in trouble in an actual race. And if you are from Pennsylvania, or familiar with Pennsylvania politics as you are, the Casey name is a political institution going back to his dad, who was governor, Bob Casey being the Auditor General of the state, now Senator Casey being in office. And he's in a statistical dead heat with his opponent, the Republican opponent, which, again, you wonder how much of that is the result of native son from Scranton, Joe Biden, not being on the top of that ticket. And again, it will be very interesting. What did the impact of Kamala Harris not picking Josh Shapiro?
Josh Shapiro, yeah.
Governor of Pennsylvania. Will she be able to go through that anthracite coal region we've talked about before, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton? Not a small, insignificant population. 600,000 folks live in that metropolitan area. Will she be able to get that turnout that Joe Biden was able to generate as native son? That can make Pennsylvania, both the Senate and Pennsylvania for the presidency, very, very interesting.
And a lot of people said that Josh Shapiro should have been her running mate, but Josh Shapiro was like, you know what, I don't know if I want to leave the governorship of Pennsylvania because there's too much at stake there, and I think there's something to be said for that.
Well, but there's another set of national Democrats, too, who would tell you that Shapiro was far too ambitious for their liking.
Well, but Josh Shapiro wants to be president one day.
Absolutely, whereas Governor Walz does not. He's already made that very clear.
No, he was the more tempered of the running mate candidates.
That is correct. That is correct.
The vice president, the choice of a vice president, really doesn't make a difference when it comes to who makes it to the Oval
You know,
Office.
Tim Walz, I think Tim Walz could be president of the could coach a high school football team as enthusiastically as he'd be president.
Yeah.
He's just that kind of a guy.
He's a perfect complement for a presidential candidate.
Which in a lot of people's minds
is not, it's not putting him down, but
no, in a lot of people's minds, it makes him such an attractive politician.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the popularity that Michelle Obama still has in the Democratic Party, I would argue a lot of that popularity is because she doesn't want to be in politics. You know, she's not a political animal. I mean, she's been very, very outspoken about the fact that she does not want a political career. She doesn't seek the spotlight. But for a lot of people, Bruce, that just makes her
more attractive.
Yeah, you gravitate towards her because you're like, you know what? If she really did do this, she'd be doing it to serve us, not serve herself or her donors. And I think that's an attractive quality that, frankly, man, we've lost from our politics.
I couldn't have said it any better. When Path to the Polls continues, for many of these young voters born in the mid to late 90s, Donald Trump is the only political candidate they have ever known. That means they don't know what a normal election is, whatever normal is. Are they tired of the rhetoric, tired of the allegations, tired of the misinformation? Are they too cynical to even turn out to vote? And the latest label thrust upon Donald Trump by his former chief of staff, John Kelly. He said Trump rules like a fascist. Don't write to me. That's what John Kelly labeled him, and warns what another term in the White House would be like and its impact on global politics. We tackle that and more when Path to the Polls continues. Welcome back to Path to the Polls. Bruce Hamilton, along with political analyst Daniel Cronrath. So with the polls so tight, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are fighting for every vote they can secure. It is not cliche to say that every vote matters this election cycle. Daniel, talk about Donald Trump's influence on the young vote. Perspective is a great thing for many. The former president is the only candidate they have ever known, and good or bad, it may have shaped their worldview. NBC News did a story about young voters born in the mid to late 90s. It bears out that the point I just mentioned, that segment of the electorate only knows the Republican Party led by Trump. And when it comes to a normal election, well, that idea is foreign to them. You teach college grads, college-age students, political science. You teach them about the world today in the world of politics. What kind of reaction does that generate to the kids you talk to?
Well, I would say the first thing that we talk about is that you know, since they have been politically actuated at some point, whenever that occurs between the ages of 8 and 12, you know, the primary socializers of people are our parents or the people who raise us, and then as they move forward with their education and through college, they get other elements of political socialization. But to your point, they have only lived in an era where Donald Trump has been a tour de force nationally, coming down the escalator in New York City in 2015, today in 2024, seeking the presidency again. That's 9 years. So if you think about voters going out for the first time to 18 to 20, they've really only known a political universe in which Donald Trump, maybe they have a distant memory of Barack Obama as a small child being elected, but for the majority of them, as you suggest, it's Donald Trump. I will tell you, I mean, there's some data to support this, Bruce, but within that demographic of 18 to 25-year-olds, Donald Trump remains very, very popular with young men. I see this quite a bit. I think that there's a lot of their anecdotal explanations that I hear is, Donald Trump has been successful at business.
Well, that's arguable.
It could be arguable. I'm just
2-3 bankruptcies.
He is somebody who exudes confidence. He's somebody that young male voters feel they identify with for whatever reason. I think recently, Trump's choice, while we could look back and analyze what was actually said, a lot of my young male students are like, we thought it was great that he went on Joe Rogan, the podcast, and he interviewed, because Joe Rogan's the most, in terms of
he's the most popular,
the most popular podcaster in the United States, and he gave Trump an opportunity to have a 3-hour-long interview. Of course, Trump
tons of misinformation, but
right. Well, and Trump missed his rally too, by the way, because he was on Joe Rogan.
3 hours.
Yeah, 3 hours late for his rally, but. I see a divide there. Now, this obviously when you involve all the demographics, where Trump does well with women, basically it's a split, particularly with Republican women, where he does much better than obviously Harris is going to do with Republican women. But with younger voters, and I don't know, Bruce, I'm trying to isolate this. I don't know if this is just for this election cycle, because really Amendment 4 is on the ballot, and the idea of a young female voter, whether they're a Democrat or Republican, to be able to have control over their own reproductive system. But I see a lot of individuals, a lot of young women who are gravitating towards Harris in this election cycle, and a lot of young men who are gravitating towards Trump. Again, back to your early point, I try to tell them that there was a time when our politics was more statesmanlike. We go back, because I can only talk to them about my lifetime growing up in a republic with a Republican dad, watching Ronald Reagan as a Republican president. While retrospectively, I may not have agreed with Reagan's policies, he was a man who composed himself with dignity while in the office. He was a statesman. He was one of the interesting things from my childhood, and I think that you were working as a reporter at the time, was sitting in my living room after the Challenger disaster and listening to President Reagan talk about the astronauts who had slipped the surly bonds of Earth. And, obviously his training as an actor was helpful in that regard, but he really spoke to the entire country during moments of tragedy. Contrasting that, to the present leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, that is just simply, you do not go to Donald Trump for sympathy. You do not go to Donald Trump to unite the nation or bring the nation together like Ronald Reagan could. So we talk about
the opposite, yeah.
And we talk about that as a contrast. And you're right. These are very, very different, different times. I would also say too that for a lot of my younger voters, they just find, policy aside, and I think this is a lot of Americans, they think Donald Trump's funny.
You don't think it makes them cynical? The rhetoric, the misinformation?
Bruce, I have gone back. I've showed them. Remember, there's that one famous ad that Hillary Clinton ran in 2016, and the name of the ad was Faces. And it had Donald Trump doing a voiceover of young women looking in a mirror, making fun of them, calling them, his voiceover saying things, I think she eats like a pig, she looks like a pig. Bruce, I play that video in my class to give them perspective on presidential elections, and everybody in the room laughs. They laugh.
Even the guy who
some of them are laughing
behind The Apprentice regrets putting Donald Trump where he did.
Some of them are laughing nervously. Others are genuinely laughing. So I can't explain human behavior. All I can do is just tell you, to answer your question, there is a core group of young voter who likes Donald Trump. They find Donald Trump inspiring for whatever reason, and that demographic exists. It exists in the electorate. Now, whether or not they turn out to vote.
That was going to be my next question.
That is another question altogether.
Is he enough for them to turn out at the polls?
Yeah. The one thing that young people still have, I tell you, is that some people will call it apathy. They feel as if they lack efficacy. Meaning this, if I do go out and vote, what good does my vote actually do? How am I going to be a change agent? In an era where they are intelligent enough to know that both of these campaigns are spending over $1 billion, okay, how does a hypothetical 19-year-old young guy student who wants to be a diesel truck mechanic, how in his mind does his vote showing up on election day actually move the needle in an election?
A lot of them don't even show up for work, so that's why I asked you, are they even going to show up at the polls?
Well, yes. I'm less critical of this generation. I have to. If I didn't have hope in this generation, I'm in the wrong line of work. I have to be, you have
to have hope.
I have to be optimistic to some degree, sure.
Yeah. I have kids in this generation, so I've got to be hopeful as a dad, too. I brought up Barack Obama earlier and his being on the campaign trail for Harris. Former president did try to convince young voters that age that this does matter. This campaign does matter. He sent this message to them on X, formerly known as Twitter, saying, you would not let a bunch of old people decide what music you're going to listen to or what clothes you're going to wear, so don't let them decide your future. A direct reference to the age difference between Harris, who is 60, and Trump, who is approaching 80. Are they tired of the same old politicians? And I mean old in every sense of the word, dictating the dictates of their lives and their future?
Well, I hate to say this for your viewing audience, Bruce, but among the younger folks out there, there is almost at what I would have to call a borderline ageist sentiment. They don't understand why individuals on both sides of both of our political parties, why Mitch McConnell, why Nancy Pelosi, why Joe Biden, why Donald Trump.
I'm tired of them.
Why are all of these people who are octogenarians or above, why are they still involved in our politics and not handing over the political process to the younger generation? I mean, we're really talking about, yeah, we talk about the baby boomers, but these are people of the silent generation. When you talk about Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, who are still in charge and controlling the levers of our politics. So yes, it is demoralizing for a lot of younger voters. They don't understand, why aren't they passing the baton? You know, I've had younger voters say to me, like, if I were 80 years old, I'd be wanting to be at home and playing with my grandkids. Why are they still, you know, controlling the levers of politics, right? Even when Nancy Pelosi turned over control of the House of Representatives to Hakeem Jeffries, we know who is still the puppeteer behind all of these big decisions taking place. It's Nancy Pelosi. That's correct.
Who forced Joe Biden out? Nancy Pelosi.
That is correct. I mean, you know, it wasn't Hakeem Jeffries. He may have had a role, but I mean, until Nancy Pelosi is out of the House, Hakeem Jeffries will never be the true leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. That's just the way it is. So, at any rate, even if you look right now on the Republican side and you look at Mitch McConnell stepping down from Senate leadership, Rick Scott is one of the people looked to be taking over the mantle, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Rick Scott's 73 years old. You know, so there is no baton handoff here taking place to a younger generation. And, you know, my generation, I'm Gen X, and I'm still not really allowed to be in the level. My generation's not to be allowed in the levers of power, so to speak. So, yeah, there is a demoralization there. I don't think a lot of younger students realize it. Let me also share something a little bit. It was Thomas Jefferson who, near the end of his life, he wrote that he thought after the Constitution was written that the Constitution should be ripped up every 19 years and a new one should be drawn.
In his, what, 40s?
Yeah. So why did Jefferson say this? Because he didn't think it was right for the next generation to have to live under the Constitution written by the previous generation. What do you think Jefferson would say today if he saw all of these octogenarians hanging on and not opening up access to younger generations to be more engaged in the political process? I mean, that was one of the fears that he had at the end of his life, is that there wouldn't be I don't want to use this relative to like January 6th, but there wouldn't be a more of a seamless transition of power, and that we would have statesmen who are making the decision to get out of politics, to turn over the reins of the country to a new generation. We don't see that happening, Bruce. We don't see that happening. I mean, to the extent, one of the most ghoulish things that I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years in our politics was what happened, the tragedy of Dianne Feinstein, literally being allowed to deteriorate in the Senate just for her vote and being told not to speak, just to vote yes by aides surrounding her. Bruce, that's not something that young people want to see. I mean, when you look at that kind of video, they're like, what are we doing? How is this the case? How is this happening?
Maybe Lin-Manuel Miranda needs to write a Broadway show for people to really get the message, because they're not getting it from social media. They're not getting it from the mainstream media. And I don't mean the jaded media. I mean the real media. Latest hot button news about Donald Trump. His longest-serving chief of staff, John Kelly, basically said he is fascist-like. We know that he made references to, Hitler. Any impact in the waning days? Kamala Harris basically said, who wants somebody who wants unchecked power? Is anything like that going to have an influence on the undecided voters, or is it just going to bounce off people like everything else has?
I would say zero. I mean, this is at a point in time where we've had so many former aides come forward, Bruce, and make allegations of everything from racism to fascism to all kinds of inappropriate behavior, and it simply has not deterred the typical Trump voter who has already made up their decision to vote for Donald Trump. I can't see that having any real sway, Bruce. I mean, you got to remember, Donald Trump is somebody who, at the time, we all thought that was offensive. He said that he could go out to the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and he wouldn't lose any support.
And nobody blinked.
Prophetic. I mean, it is absolutely that way to this day. And, there again, going back to the beginning of the broadcast, I think, perhaps if Kamala Harris had come on the scene and she had been more detailed and more specific, it would have made a difference. But then again, as a skeptic, I think that the people who are voting for Donald Trump, there's going to be very, very little to move them off of that island. And then after this election, perhaps if Donald Trump's not reelected, we could have a conversation about who the future of the Republican Party is. Because that's when things really get interesting. What kind of party will the Republican Party shape themselves as? Who will become the de facto leaders of the Republican Party? But listen, man, we've got to wait until next Tuesday first, because Donald Trump could very easily be reelected president of the United States next Tuesday.
Do we know who wins next Tuesday night, or is this a protracted process?
I don't think we're going to know probably until Wednesday morning.
You think that soon?
Yeah,
I think
Wednesday morning, Wednesday, late Wednesday.
Oh, I see. I think it's more like Friday if we're lucky.
Okay. Well,
But I mean, that's, you know.
It's certainly not going to be on election night. We know that.
It's not.
I mean, just by the way, by virtue of states like Pennsylvania who don't begin to count their absentee ballots until after the polls close, okay, that means they're literally counting until Wednesday morning those absentee ballots from the military and students and other people who have used an absentee. So there's no way you're going to be able to get an accurate prediction of what's going to be happening on election night. However, you might be able to get something to go to bed with. I mean, if you see that there are states that are being called early that we thought were going to be competitive, then that could give you an indication of what it's going to be like on Thursday or Friday morning, as you suggest when you wake up, what you're going to see.
All right, let me pose an if. If the election is close, if Donald Trump does not win, division, derision?
Both. I'm really, really concerned about the outcome of the election, Bruce. And I think, you know, one of the things particularly as individuals, while we're all told not to trust the polls, okay, you can easily see a scenario where Donald Trump goes into Election Day tied in the polls, perhaps for whatever reason, because this has been suggested now for people to know that Trump's support has actually been oversampled based upon their turnout. What does Trump do if on Election Day he ends up losing 2-3 percentage points nationally when the polls showed him as tied? How does he react? How do his supporters react? The one thing I can guarantee you is that we're not going to have another January 6th event with the Capitol Police overwhelmed. You're going to have a full contingency of soldiers outside of that Capitol building this time.
They're ready.
Regardless of what happens, to avoid that kind of violence that we had on January 6th, where the Capitol Police were overwhelmed, and then, of course, all the controversy about why weren't troops brought in, earlier in that process to protect the Capitol. There's not going to be any mistakes made this time, Bruce. There's going to be a military presence surrounding the Capitol building to make sure that at least that part of the transition of power goes off. Will Donald Trump attend an inauguration for Kamala Harris? Absolutely not. He didn't attend it for Joe Biden. He's not going to attend it for Harris. I mean, I hope the only thing, if we do have a Trump loss, is for the sake and the integrity of not only our election system, but globally around the world, as a country that prides itself in free and fair elections. I just pray that if it does go that way for the former president, and he does end up losing, that we can do a peaceful transition of power.
And he's already said that if he wins, he's not promising a smooth transition either when it comes to all the office politics. I guess time will tell.
Time will tell.
Daniel, always a pleasure. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Bruce. It's always good to be here with you, too.
And now, a personal word. I want to leave you with this. On this program, the information is sourced, it is vetted, it is researched, it is accurate. There is no political agenda, regardless of what you want to believe. Our only agenda is to provide you, the voter, the information you need to make an educated choice. Your choice. Despite the acrimonious emails I receive, typically along party lines, with those who simply refuse to politely agree to disagree, understand our agenda, my agenda, is only as I described. That said, I understand there are those of you who will believe what you may, and that is your right. No, it is your privilege to vote. Yes, it is a privilege. And every supervisor of elections and every secretary of state with whom I have spoken assures me, and has assured you on these very broadcast, streaming, and web channels, every step is taken to make sure the vote and vote count is fair and accurate. It is journalistic ethics that we maintain to build everything we do at News4JAX. And again, on a personal note, it is that same foundation of journalistic ethics that I employ and has served me my entire life, and I am mindful of every day. It is something never to be compromised. Of that, I am very mindful. Path to the Polls airs again tonight at 7 p.m. on News4JAX Plus, or you can watch on demand anytime on the News4JAX YouTube channel and News4JAX.com. I'm Bruce Hamilton. If you know nothing else, know I appreciate you.
See why every day more people are choosing News4JAX, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.